Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alvaro Camina. I'm part of the SAC. I'm going to moderate this session on species-specific responses to onshore and offshore wind energy projects. We have 5 speakers, but before that, 2 announcements. One is that the poll for the best poster, it will remain open until tomorrow noon. And the second is to all the attendants to avoid any walk around the Place de Comédie, because there are a lot of protests, and the police are using water cannon and also tear gases. And one participant has suffered already because of that. So let's start as fast as possible. And I guess each presenter may introduce briefly themselves. So the first speaker is Michael Whitby from Bat Conservation International, who will introduce.
Do I change it up here? Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'm Michael Whitby. I'm the director of bats and wind energy at Bat Conservation International, and we evaluate the effects of wind energy on bats and find and investigate ways to find scalable solutions for the coexistence of wind energy and sustainable bat populations. And today I'll be introducing an interesting project that we're conducting in the Pacific Ocean in anticipation of wind energy being developed on the west coast of the United States. We all are aware of the expanding wind energy, offshore wind energy around the globe. In the United States, that seems to have rapidly decelerated in the last 6 months. However, this conference is a good indicator of the rapidly growing interest in offshore wind. I think at the last CWW, there were probably only a handful of offshore wind talks, and now I see that it's a random guesstimate of nearly half the presentations and talks here. But you might not think about bats in the offshore wind. Well, today I'm going to try to convince you that bats are a marine mammal. Not really. But bats do go offshore fairly regularly. And this was first investigated in the North Sea, so that may not come as a surprise to you. However, in the North Sea, bats are observed moving between 2 giant land masses. What you may not be aware of is how often bats are seen on the east coast of the United States. Solik and Newman provided this article on a comprehensive review of decades of records of bats in the offshore environment in the North Atlantic. And they found dozens, possibly 100 or so, records of bats in the offshore environment. And this goes back to the 1800s with bats being observed from ships. And these are, I think one of the records goes out as far as over 100 kilometers from shore. And so what are bats doing offshore? We're not sure. And there's even less information than I presented there for the Atlantic on the Pacific Ocean. There are very few records of bats in the Pacific Ocean, with the exception of Southeast Farallon Island. This island is around 20 kilometers off the coast of San Francisco. And this is in the middle of the Pacific, well, it's in the Pacific Ocean with not in any direct line between land masses unless you connect Alaska and California, which would be a very long journey. However, at Southeast Farallon Islands, bats have been observed for decades, and they have been counted on the island. The island has 3 trees, and they stop over during migration there. And then an additional record exists in the offshore environment, exactly in the area that wind energy has been planned and the existing lease is. So we set out to do a baseline study of bats in the offshore in the Pacific. However, as with most problems, there's not many ways to sample an ocean for bats. There are very few platforms. There are occasionally buoys. And we can use what we refer to as ships of opportunity, which are vessels that we have no control of that are very generous and allow us to place a bat detector and it records just wherever they go. This prevents us from doing systematic studies that are needed to evaluate the spatial distribution of bats. So we partnered with Saildrone, which is an manufacturer and operator of uncrewed surface vehicles. These vessels are extremely well tested. They have circumnavigated the globe. They have entered hurricanes. They have sailed around Antarctica. And they're extremely stable. And as I said, they're well established and platforms. The vessel we used is one of their smaller vessels. It's wind-propelled and solar-propelled, 0 carbon emissions. What a bonus. And it's 5 meters tall and offers various weather sensors. And so what we did is we put an SM4 bat detector on the top as an initial trial. We did not integrate it into the platform simply because this was a month-long trial that we were doing. And so then we went and sailed this vessel around Southeast Farallon Island, where we know that there are bats active, simply to see the ruggedity, how rugged the bat detector is on the Saildrone. One challenge of sampling bats is most of the time the marine environment actually destroys the detector. And so we wanted to make sure it lasted on this platform, and also that it recorded bats when we knew they were present. And so, as I mentioned, there's records of bats on the island. They stop over there in September and during fall migration and roost visibly on 1 or 2 of the trees that are there. There are only 4 trees present on the island. And then we also, for a wider project, we also had a stationary acoustic monitor on the island. And so when we drove around the island for a month, we had this horseshoe pattern that was deviated from during certain surf and weather conditions to avoid sending the Saildrone into the rocky island. But as you can see here, we recorded bats everywhere we went, and including areas we did not frequent. And so we see that even though we're 20 kilometers offshore, there's only one small island. As I said, there's no connectivity here, like direct line between land masses, that there is consistent bat activity during our sample period. And this activity takes various forms. It can be single passes. However, there are also times that we notice distinct strings of bat activity where the bat actually appeared to be, it might have been following the Saildrone vessel. And part of that conclusion is because we have some calls here of very broadband calls that indicate the bat might be attracted to and investigating the Saildrone itself. In this open environment, we expect very flat calls and long calls for these species. However, as you see in the spectrogram on the right, these are very broadband and indicate that the bat might have been close to and investigating the vessel. We analyzed the time, the weather conditions that we observed bats during, and we found that bats mostly occurred in the first 6 hours after dusk, with activity decreasing towards sunrise. We also found that activity increased during mid-September, which happened to also be the full moon period. And that period was identified through an Cryon et al. Analysis of the roosting patterns of bats on the island, that they tended to aggregate on the island during full moons. We also found that bats were more likely to be found when the wind speed was from the north. So overall, we thought this was a successful test, but we wanted to take it a step further. I mentioned before that we had acoustic monitoring and daily searches conducted during this sample period. And so we simply compared the sail drone activity and the island-based bat activity of two prominent species, the hoary bat and the Mexican free-tailed bat, and calls that were not able to be identified. And as we see, these peaks very nicely align. And then we add in the number of island sightings for different days. And again, all of the peaks align. So it looks like the sail drone is a useful tool for monitoring offshore bat activity. This now provides another option to do design studies in the offshore environment where platforms are not available. This allows us to understand the spatial distribution of bat activity better. And overall, we are also finding that activity in the Pacific was much higher than we expected, and that the timing and species have, the two species I mentioned, the hoary bat and the Mexican free-tailed bat, are both affected greatly by wind energy onshore. And so the prevalence of these bats in the offshore environment has implications for wind development planned for the region.
Thank you, Michael. Just continue with the announcement. It seems the situation is escalating with the protests, so be aware if you are leaving the conference or when going to the hotel or so. So now, Tatsuda, Mr. Tatsuda, the floor is yours.
Do you have a PowerPoint presentation? This one? Oh, no. Okay. This one. So basically, you see. Okay, sorry. And should we? I just don't remember. Yeah, you can use like that. It's okay.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Tatsuya Ura, and I'm from the Wild Bird Society of Japan. I'd like to talk about changes in the flight path of geese and swan before and after the construction of 7 onshore wind farm in northern Hokkaido, Japan. Yeah. The impact of wind farms on birds included these three. And when such barriers occur, birds increase their flight distance to avoid wind turbines, and resulting in additional energy consumption. Where bird collision in Japan are at some level known about. But however, there are only 1 or 2 cases to study, each for habitat loss and barrier to movement, involving comparative research before and after wind farm construction. That is because post-construction survey are not required in Japan. This case study from Japan uses before and after compared impacts to examine barrier to movement. Before wind farms were built, honey buzzards flew along the ridge of mountains during migration period. However, after the wind farm is installed on the ridge, the birds changed their flight path to above them. This is a case study of swans in Japan. It shows that the number of swans observed flying over the area decreased after wind turbines were built there. The Ministry of the Environment in Japan may express strong opinion to developers regarding wind power construction projects located along the migratory bird route in accordance with the Environment Impact Assessment Act. However, as the Minister's opinion carry no legal force, developers are under no obligation to comply. Operators largely ignore barrier to movement because these don't cause collision deaths of rare birds. In Japan, many operators are not interested in avoiding the construction of wind farm on or near important migratory bird route, and the government guidance has been ineffective in this matter. Japan's northernmost region is one of the country's most important migratory bird route. Due to its excellent wind conditions, many wind turbines have been constructed in the area since 2022. Prior to turbine construction, our society gathered data on migratory bird route to create a sensitivity map concerning birds and wind turbines in this region. We therefore decided to compare the migratory behavior of geese and swan before and after the construction of wind farm. Regarding the survey methodology, the target species were the white-fronted geese and being goose and Berwick swan and Hooper swan. The survey was conducted in autumn 2016 and spring 2017 and the autumn 2017 prior to wind turbines construction. The post-construction period was from autumn 2023 to spring 2025. During each survey period, 1 or 2 people remained on site for around 3 weeks and making fixed point observations of migratory bird flight using binocular and visual observation. Survey sites were selected from predetermined setup, considering the weather on the day and the flight activity of migratory birds. However, to avoid bias toward sites with high bird activity, sites with little or no bird flight were also selected. Survey result. The figure on the far left show migratory bird route prior to the construction of wind farms. The pink line shows the flight path in spring 2017, and the orange line shows the autumn migration route in both 2016 and 17. The white text shows the number of flight tracks and the average number of bird per flocks and the average flight track distance. The figure on the right shows the survey results from 2023 onwards. Looking at the autumn 2023 figure, it is evident that the width of the migration route has narrowed, probably due to bird avoiding the wind turbines. The spring 2024 figure shows that in addition to the narrow migration route, a new route has formed to the east of the wind farms. The autumn 2024 figure shows an even narrow migration route with compared to autumn 2023, as well as migration route established to the east of the wind farms. The spring 2025 figure shows that the new migration route to the east, which appeared in spring 2024, has disappeared. Overall, birds now avoid the wind farms when migrating in both spring and autumn. The red circle indicate location where it is through thought that barrier effect occur due to the construction of wind farm. And the light blue dotted circles show location where migratory birds flew infrequently even before construction, but where flight activity decreases further after construction. The blue circle shows when birds pass through the southernmost edge of the wind farm in autumn 2023. However, when the number of turbines increases in the southern part of the wind farm in summer 2024, by autumn the birds have stopped flying along the southern edge and were flying further south instead. The yellow circles show location where migratory birds fly above wind turbines built at lower elevations. Within the study area, we confirmed that the bird migration distance increased by an average of 5.5%, with a maximum increase of 15.5%. Conclusion. It has been shown that construction wind farm along the migration route of geese and swan cause a barrier to movement. On average, birds flew 5.5 kilometers to avoid wind turbine within the study area. Therefore, the impact of the short-term survival rate of these birds is expected to be small. Birds are considered to have avoided wind turbines over such a short distance because the direction of the wind turbine line did not intersect vertically with their flight path. Regarding cumulative impacts, while the impact on birds may appear small when viewed in single areas, it could become significant when considered across entire migration route spanning hundreds to thousands of kilometers. And the future step. Future work requires detailed analysis of the pattern of barrier effect across different bird species. This must include the analysis of bird flow along migration route as well as changing in flight path curvature. Yeah, thank you, finish.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tatsuda. We are following strictly the time. So now it's the time for Larissa Biasotto, and she will speak on layers macaws in Brazil.
Maybe I will need help here. Maybe not. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. My name is Larissa Biasotto. I'm working BirdLife International, and now I will present a different topic, is the last channel in the energy workflow. I will speak about Lear's macaw electrocution and how to map the priority areas to mitigate electrocution. So first, just to bring you information about the species, Lear's macaw is a species endemic from Brazil, Caatinga. It was rediscovered on Nature in the 80s, and since there is classified by Red List as an endangered species. We currently have two small populations, and the main one, covering more than 90% of population, is in Raso da Catarina. Also, regarding Caatinga, Caatinga is the largest tropical dry forest region in South America, and Sertão, specifically, where we can find Lear's macaw, is one of the most populated semi-arid regions in the world. And we have millions of people that are still living there without access to electricity. So there is no doubt we need the power lines, and that's why the energy grid is expanding very fast. Also, regarding Lear's macaw, as I mentioned, is a small population. We have less than 2,600 individuals on Nature. They are distributed along with these 10 roosting sites. They are using these arenito cliffs to reproduce, so they are very specific regarding the sites they are reproducing. Regarding the key food resource is liquid, that also a palm endemic from Caatinga. And because of the presence of power lines, these lovely macaws are using these infrastructures to perch while they feed on liquid. And because of the curiosity, they are like intentional, they present intense social behavior. So they are interacting with the energy, the power lines, and also with other individuals. Sometimes we have more than 30 individuals perched on lines. So here you can see like a monophasic cable insulated, so of course you will not see electrocution. Okay, because of this behavior, also we have a lot of fatalities. Macaws are being died by electrocution, and this number is increasing mainly from 2020, I will say. That was when we creating a working group to study Lear's macaw electrocution and to try to push some mitigations. And one of the things we identify as a group, as a priority, is to map the risky areas for electrocution to push the mitigations. So how this map, why this map is important and how it could help conservation. I can flag 3 different reasons. First, to guide robust sampling designs to estimate the real number of fatalities. This number that I showed to you is underestimated. Local community is finding the carcasses, so we have a lot of remote areas without people to find the carcasses. So the real number we don't know. Also, is important to quantify mortality to study the implications in population dynamics and to systematize the installation of mitigation measures and in the future evaluate the effectiveness as well. So here I'm showing the workflow that we carried out to map the distribution of the risky. So we have different steps. This approach can be applied to other species, but of course I will focus on Lear's macaque. And everything starts from identify priority species. And why Lear's macaque is a priority species? Well, because it has large bodies and wingspan, is a small population, is spatially limited distributed, and they often using the cables to perch, and they have like a propensity to interact with each other and also with the electric components. So Lear's macaque is a priority species. Based on that, we need to start the mapping. And here I have 2 steps. The risk is a result from susceptibility and exposure. And we are mapping that independently. To map susceptibility, here we have some innovations. We didn't work with distribution area. We mapped the main areas for activity for Lear's macaque. So we used occurrence records inside the distribution range, the maximum displacement, the distance from roosting sites, and the density of liquid palm to model the area of activity. We use maximum entropy modeling, but in this step, depends on the organism you are studying and the information available, you can adapt the modeling. The next step is to map the exposure. And for this, we got all the information regarding the pylons on the area from ANEEL, the governmental agency responsible for energy in Brazil. And here we also have an innovation that we worked with the number of phases per grid cell, because if the pylons has more phases, we have more risk of electrocution. That's proportional. And here you can see, like in the background, the liquid palm occurrence and the power line density phase. So, as a result from susceptibility and exposure, we can map the risk, as I mentioned. And this map is important because we can identify proactive mitigation zoning, priority regions for action or councils, and also main grid segments for retrofitting. And from this result, we can go, we can validate our maps using the records if they are available. And also we can run a cost-benefit analysis, showing the trade-off between the number of pylons we need to mitigate to decrease fatalities. So here is some results. I will not focus on the map, but we validate our map using 78 carcasses. So the validation is showing that our map is working to infer about risk of electrocution. And we also highlighted the main councils, the main regions we need to act. So for Lear's macaque, that should be multifocal. It's not one priority area. It's like different 14. And finally, the cost-benefit analysis. We worked with 4 different scenarios to test, from 1% and 20% of risk grid cells. So here we are measuring how many fatalities we could reduce if we mitigate the pylons. And the first scenario, if we mitigate 1%, we can reach 35%, we can decrease 35% of no fatalities. And it's a very small population, it's less than 2,600 individuals. The same still for the 5%, that in that case we needed to mitigate around 22,000 pylons. But again, maybe is not enough to guarantee the future population viability. So, if we mitigate 10% of risky pylons, we could reduce around 80% of mortality. That means 37,000 pylons. And in the last scenario, 20%, the number of pylons we need to mitigate is double. So maybe it will not be financially and logistically feasible for the energy company. So in this case, our recommendation is at least 10% of risky pylons. Any number below that maybe will not be enough. And here I have my take-home messages. So first, probably we don't have a device that is mitigating electrocution for all birds. As I mentioned, Lear's macaque, they present a very different behavior. They are not raptors, they are perching on pylons and like standing there. So let's push that. For Lear's macaque, mitigation needs to be multifocal and as fast as possible, starting from these roosting sites with liquid around and expanding. And finally, the electrocution risk map can help species conservation, but is also an important tool to guide the electric agencies in their mitigation planning. We published this article in Journal Applied Ecology last month, so it's open access. If you want to check more details about the modeling approach or about other informations regarding Lear's macaque, also you can ask any question. Some acknowledgements, so I would say thank you to my collaborators and thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thanks to all the speakers because they are all ahead of the schedule. So now let's hear Christina Bauch from Christine Bauch. What's your name?
Thank you. I'm going to talk about auks in the German North Sea, about their distribution and displacement effects. This project is a cooperation between IBL and Bioconsult, two environmental planning agency based in northern Germany. No. With increasing demand for a further expansion of offshore wind energy, there is a legitimate concern about adverse effects on the marine ecosystem and the individual species within it. And as part of the mandatory monitoring, there has been displacement effects have been investigated for many species, and among the seabirds, the auks have been identified as a group of concern in this respect. As the most common auk species in the German North Sea are razorbills and guillemots. They occur in large numbers in autumn and winter. There is a breeding colony in Germany on the island of Helgoland, and in autumn and winter, so outside the breeding season, birds from Britain and Scandinavia migrate into German waters. We studied the following questions: how far does the displacement distance reach, whether there are seasonal differences, whether the species differ, and what does it mean? What is the proportion of reduction of guillemots and razorbills in the wind farm areas? And data for this study were collected via digital aerial surveys and ship-based surveys, and surveys were conducted according to a standard guidelines, the Stuck 4, which is mandatory in Germany. Additionally, we were provided by data from research projects from the Federal Office for Nature Conservation in Germany. Here you see a map of the German North Sea. In red, you see the wind farms in operation in 2021. The hatched areas are conservation areas, and here is the island of Helgoland, where the breeding colony is. for both species. We used post-construction data which were collected as part of the mandatory monitoring for every wind farm, and these were 22 wind farms, and these data originate from 2014 to 2021. We analyzed the data using a Gaussian Markov random fields in integrated nested Laplace approximation, and this leads robust estimates of seabird distributions in space and time. As you may know, seabirds occur very variable in space and time, and so this statistical approach is suitable for these kind of heterogeneous data. And an advantage is that it doesn't require pre-construction data, and it allows a model validation. And that this approach is applicable, it has been tested and published because there was a study on divers, displacement in divers in the same area, and this has been published by Villela and colleagues in Frontiers in Marine Science. What you see here is a map of the German North Sea without this tail that was not surveyed. And you see the distribution of guillemots, and you see they are concentrated here close to the breeding colony Helgoland in autumn, and additionally there is a concentration of probably birds migrating into German waters from Scandinavia and Britain. And this is the number of individuals that were counted. And in comparison, you see that in winter, the distribution is more widespread. And these are the wind farms, right? And there is a very similar number of individuals, but the concentration differs, and therefore note that this scale differs between the graphs. And in brief, the razorbills occur in lower numbers, especially in autumn. There are very low numbers, while in winter there are like similar numbers as guillemots. The distribution is rather similar. You have in autumn the concentrations, and in winter a more widespread distribution. You see the model output which compares the density of guillemots compared to the mean density in the surveyed area. So the mean density of the surveyed area is this horizontal red line, and in yellow is the model curve, and in black the dashed line are the 95 credible intervals where we expect our estimate to fall into. And you see there is a large variation, which is due to between individual variation, which is not surprising in biological wild populations. And what you can see that the upper credible interval intersects with the mean density, so up to that distance, the density here is lower. So it measures the density to the nearest wind farm. And the density up to about 6 kilometers is lower, but to be on the safe side, we define the displacement distance where the model curve intersects with the mean density, which is about 12 kilometers. And you see there is a higher than average density further away, which if you remember the graph with the distribution, you saw that there were areas of high concentration close to the breeding colony, for example. And in winter, we find a much lower displacement distance, which is at about 2 kilometers. So we find a lower displacement distance in winter than in autumn for guillemots. And the results are very similar for razorbills. Note, however, the low sample size in autumn for razorbills, so we find also low displacement distance in winter. So this translates into a proportion of reduction of individuals in the wind park area up to a kilometer. Guillemots are reduced by 76% in autumn, while in winter they are reduced by 36%. So in autumn the displacement is, or the proportion of reduction is higher than in winter. And for razorbills, we see a similar pattern, similar tendency, but it looks like that the effect is stronger in guillemots than in razorbills. So to come back to the research questions, how far does the displacement distance reach? We found that it reaches up to 12 kilometers. Yes, we find seasonal differences, so it highlights the importance to not just pool the data of the entire data set of a year, but to look at the seasons differently, which might be due to behavioral differences within individuals, or it might be that individuals migrating into German waters in winter, that they differ. So that would be the next question to investigate. Do the species differ? So we see the same seasonal tendencies, potentially stronger effect in guillemots. And the proportion of reduction is higher in autumn than in winter. With this, I want to thank you for your attention and thank all the parties that provided the data and the funding. And if you are interested in the study, it is currently available as a report, and you can find it on the website of the BWO, or you just use Google Scholar and Google Orcs in the German North Sea, and then you can find it. Thanks.
Okay, so let's hear our last speaker. The situation outside has become calm, so it's not to be so worried as the previous announcement is from the organizing committee. They are just to avoid maybe some streets, but everything's calm.
Great, thanks very much. My name's Gordon Hasty. I'm a researcher at the Sea Mammal Research Unit, which is a department in the University of St Andrews over in Scotland. As many of us will know in the audience and in this conference, there's now a really good evidence base showing that harbour porpoises, this small cetacean, exhibit behavioural responses to pile driving during the construction of offshore wind farms, leading to avoidance of areas around the wind farm. And probably the most common approach to trying to characterise these impacts is the use of arrays of static, autonomous, either recorders or click detectors, loggers, which detect the echolocation clicks of harbour porpoises. And these are generally deployed before, during, and after pile driving to investigate changes in porpoise presence. And this is often carried out with the aim of developing proxy dose-response relationships. So the relationship between the acoustic dose the animal receives or the received noise level that the animal receives and the probability or magnitude of a behavioral response. And there's an increasing number of these dose-response relationships for porpoises to pile driving in the literature. And although these almost universally show reductions in porpoise acoustic presence with acoustic dose or distance from the pile driving, there are subtle differences in some of these relationships. And in order to investigate the transferability of these dose-response relationships to new areas or developments in order to predict the potential impacts of new developments, we need to understand what might be driving some of those differences. Some of the factors we might be interested in could be wind farm location, habitat type, pile characteristics, pile size, or potentially mitigation actions. However, one of the problems that we have is that in addition to the differences we might be interested in, most studies also typically vary in the design of the acoustic arrays that have been used to collect the data. And this is the potential to drive some of the differences we're seeing in the responses between different studies. Now, array designs in the literature typically vary in two key aspects. The first of these is the number of acoustic devices, the number of loggers used in the arrays. Typically, there's between about 8 to 10 devices used in an array, but these can range from studies which only have one all the way up to studies which have over 60. The second variable is the spatial extent of the array. Although comparative studies might have similar numbers of devices, the ranges at which they're deployed from the pile driving can vary substantially, from between about 10 kilometers from the pile driving up to beyond 80 kilometers. So in the current study, we sought to investigate the potential effects of the differences in these two key variables might have on our ability to firstly detect behavior responses by porpoises, but secondly on the nature of these responses. So what do the dose responses relationships look like with differences in these array designs? So for this, we turn to an existing data set collected by our co-authors at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland during their study of the effects of pile driving in the Moray Firth off the northeast coast of Scotland. And this is really an unrivaled set of data with a total of 68 CPODs deployed during pile driving. And it really represents sort of a gold standard in terms of the number of CPODs that are deployed around pile driving. They were deployed between 400 meters and 80 kilometers from the pile driving location. And a series of models were constructed looking at the relationship between received level of noise and the probability of response. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the actual modeling approach that was used in the original paper, other than to say one of the key results was that they discovered a significant relationship between the sound exposure level and the probability of the response, so this dose-response relationship. So to investigate the effects of our two array variables, we effectively took a data thinning approach to this, where we artificially modified the array configuration by randomly selecting subsets of the CPOD data, so these are acoustic loggers, from certain locations to create different array designs. We then repeated the same modeling approach that was carried out in the original paper to investigate how the results for each new array design might differ from those presented in the original paper. Effectively, we ran 500 model iterations for each combination of the number of CPODs in the array and the maximum spatial extent of the array. And in order to quantify the effect of array design, we calculated 3 metrics. The first of these was simply a measure of the relative statistical power, and that was simply the proportion of our 500 simulations in each scenario where sound level remained a significant predictor of response probability. The second was a measure of the shape of the derived dose-response relationships. We combined the derived dose-response relationships with a simple sound propagation loss model, applied this to a uniform density of harbour porpoises. Here we used 1 per kilometre squared, and we estimated the number of porpoises that were predicted to respond from that dose-response relationship. And the third was also a measure of the nature of the derived dose-response relationship, and this was the effective response range measure, which is described by Peter Tajak and Len Thomas in their 2019 paper. This is based on that second step, the number of porpoises predicted to respond from a dose-response relationship, and it's effectively calculated as the radius in kilometres at which as many porpoises respond beyond this radius as fail to respond within that radius. So if we leap to the first of our results, looking at the relative statistical power, what this matrix here shows you effectively, each little cell is one of our scenarios that are subsampling scenarios. And the color coding simply represents the proportion of those 500 model simulations for each of these different scenarios, where the sound exposure level was retained as a significant predictor of response probability. And if you remember, this is our gold standard up here. This is the full data set, 68 CPODs deployed out to 80 kilometers. So what you can simply quickly see in this example is that for the majority of the scenarios that we've done, there's still pretty good statistical power to detect that relationship. But as we start to get down to these lower numbers of CPODs down here, you can't really see the colors in here, but you can see that the colors are very light and that you're getting very, very low statistical power to detect that relationship for low numbers of CPODs. And there's also a suggestion that the smaller array sizes, so below about 30 kilometers, you're starting to get relatively low statistical power to detect that relationship there. But clearly, it's not simply about whether you get a significant relationship, it's also about the shape of that derived relationship. If we look in a bit more detail at the number of acoustic devices in our array, This little graph here represents the relationship between the SEL and the probability of response. And if you remember, our full array is 68 CPODs. So what we've done here is run the simulations for randomly selecting 65 CPODs in that array. And the black lines represent the original model, the mean and the 95% confidence intervals around that. And the blue represents the subsampled dose-response relationships. So you can see for 65, it's pretty close to the original model. As we start to thin out that data set down to 55, 45, 35, you can see we start to get a bit more variation in those dose-response relationships where they start to diverge from that original model. And even more so as we get down to these smaller numbers of CPODs, where below, between about 5 or 10, you're really getting dose-response relationships which bear very little resemblance to that original dose-response relationship from the full array. And importantly, this feeds directly through to the number of porpoises you predicted to be displaced and the calculated effective response ranges. Along the x-axis here are the number of CPOD locations, and these are the predicted number of porpoises and effective response ranges from all of our model runs. And again, you can see the really wide variation in both those metrics for the smaller numbers of CPOD locations. So secondly, we looked at the effects of the array extent on the derived dose-response curves. Here we fixed it to a total of 30 acoustic loggers, and again we've done a similar data thinning approach where the original one, where we used an 80-kilometer array, you can see the original one, most of the 30 CPOD subsampled arrays are pretty close to that original model. And as we start to get smaller and smaller arrays, we do see a bit more variation in the derived dose-response relationships. And very much so as we get to these smaller arrays. And one thing to note here is that the vertical line in each of these represents the area to the left of this vertical line represents where we're starting to predict outside the range of our data. But the other thing to notice as we get to these smaller arrays, we start to seemingly over-predict the response probability at the higher noise levels and under-predict the response probability at the lower levels. And the effect this seems to have is that you start to get a positive relationship between the array extent and the number of porpoises predicted to respond and the effective response ranges, where you can see relatively low numbers of porpoises for these smaller arrays compared to the larger arrays. And if we test this statistically, we can see there's a significant difference in the 10 to 40 kilometer array extents when we compare it to the full 80 kilometer array. There's a statistical difference between these scenarios and the 80 kilometer, and there's no significant difference between these ones. So it appears to plateau from about 50 kilometers upwards. So what this tells us is that we probably would have had a reasonable chance of capturing that original dose-response relationship that we got with a full array if we'd only deployed out to about a 50 kilometer radius. But this does lead to the rather obvious question is that what array extent should we be deploying our loggers within, both looking back to data that's already been collected, but perhaps more usefully in terms of future designs of arrays. The risk of having an array that's too small are that obviously we miss capturing the true scale of the impact, and we also end up predicting quite widely outside the range of our data. The risk of having an array that's too large is that not only do we spend extra ship time, we spend extra money deploying loggers at high ranges, but you also risk capturing stochastic responses which are completely unrelated to the pal driving at these high ranges, which effectively pulls up the tail of that dose-response relationship, which can have significant impacts on the number of porpoises that you predict to respond. For me, I think we should be looking more at some of the approaches that are used both in medicine and also in some of the individual response studies that we use to drive dose-response relationships, particularly some of the studies that have used tag data. This is an example of a study looking at the behavioral responses by killer whales to sonar. And what's done here is that the two ends of the dose-response relationship are effectively tied to biologically meaningful levels. The lower bound in this study was effectively tied to a lower limit of their hearing sensitivity, so to the lower limit of audibility to the noise that they're actually playing back to it. And I think this is a really important approach that we should be considering when we're analysing some of this acoustic array data. So just to conclude, it's clear that array design does matter when using acoustic arrays to derive dose-response relationships. It'll come as no surprise, but low numbers of acoustic devices led to a high chance of a false negative result. That is not detecting a significant relationship where one exists. Further, the derived dose-response relationships are highly variable for these low-number scenarios, such that the predicted number of porpoises and the predicted effective response ranges was also highly variable. For me, the slightly more surprising result was the one with the spatial extent of the array, where the dose-response relationships are clearly influenced by array extent. We seem to get a relatively positive relationship between the array extent and the number of porpoises and effective response ranges. And I think it's important going forward that really need to consider the appropriate array size in the data collection and analyses and where we actually truncate that data that we're going to be analyzing. Potentially, we could look at fixing the probability to 0 where responses are simply not plausible. So maybe it's the range of audibility by harbor porpoises. And the results also highlight, I think, that it's really important to consider array design when we're trying to compare results between existing studies, and hopefully provides a bit of a basis for designing future acoustic arrays when looking at porpoise responses to piling. And with that, yeah, just a thank you to my colleagues, those of us that helped. The project was part of the Prepared project, which was funded by the Offshore Wind Evidence Change Programme. Thank you very much.
Oh. Okay, thank you very much to the speakers. The protests are over, so there is no problem outside. So please come to the front, and the floor is for whoever wants to make a question. We have many very different topics to deal with.
Thank you. My first question is to Michael. I would like to know what's the boat autonomy? The autonomy of the boat, of the uncrewed vehicle.
So we had, we told Saildrone exactly where we wanted it to go. And as long as they could go there based on the weather conditions, it is sail, it's using the wind power, and it does have a small solar powered motor, but so it's restrained a little bit by conditions of the sea and the weather, but you can fully control where it goes within those parameters.
And how long can it be in the sea by itself?
So they have different models. That one, I think, the Explorer that we use, I think, could go possibly up to a year. But they also have some battery-powered ones that they do that are larger that they tend to do for a month or 2 months before they come back to port too. They have a generator as well to charge the batteries, so they refuel the generator.
That's impressive. Thank you. And my second question is to Tatsuya. I would like to know if do you have any estimation of the mortality of the birds in those wind farms?
In this study, I didn't have a mortality calculation. Only observe and avoid wind farm birds and not calculation for
Okay, and
mortality.
did you see if the number of migrating birds has been reduced in the last years?
Sorry, one more.
Has the number of migratory birds been reduced in the last years?
So migratory bird number is not reduction, not decrease. Maybe say same number, and route was changed, only changed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe a question to Gordon for the last presentation. The researcher based on was with 2.2 meter piles. That's sort of tiny compared to what they're now putting in the North Sea. Do you see any effects of that, sort of these bigger sizes? Will it have a big effect on how you would design such an array?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's exactly the point, I think, as we start to go to different pile sizes and we start to try and compare different studies. I think, yeah, the sort of message I was trying to make is that we need to consider the array design in, when we're starting to compare these ones. And I guess if they're high levels of noise, you might consider larger arrays, I guess, if you're thinking that you want to capture the full distance where the animals are going to be able to hear the pile driving, and potentially you could have a behavioral response attributable to the pile driving.
Yeah, thanks. Also, here's Ansgar from Bioconsult SH. I have also a question to Gordon for the last talk. Thanks, it was a brilliant talk. My question is, you covered a distance up to 80 kilometers or 85 kilometers even. Could you even detect any response at that distance to the piling?
Yeah, I guess that's the issue. With the approach that was taken, you do get, I mean, they're sort of distilling all that data down to a 1 or a 0, and it's effectively whether there was a 50% decline in seapod detection rate compared to a baseline before the piling event. When you distill down to that 1s and 0s, you're going to get stochastic 1s and 0s in that data, regardless of whether it's a pile drive, a response to the pile driving. So yes, there's 1s in that data set out to 70 kilometers, I think, 76 kilometers. But it's arguable whether that 1 is, a random 1 or whether it's actually attributable to the pile driving.
No more questions?
Hi, great talks, everybody. I had a question for Christina about the ox. I was wondering, what do you think drove the difference between the winter and the autumn response? Because both of those are supposed to be energetically challenging times, right? The molt and overwintering. So I guess I was just surprised that the responses were so different.
Yeah, it's indeed, it's a strong difference, rather. We thought of several things. So one thing could be that the auks are flightless in autumn. They molt and they are young, are accompanied by their parents. So it could be that they are more risk aware, so that therefore they avoid. Or it could be that because in winter there are additional birds migrating into German waters, that they have a different behavior. I mean, if you find that likely or not, but that would be an option, that there are different birds coming in. Yeah, so these are maybe because the food availability, you wouldn't think it's different in, and the model is agnostic to the wind farms. Yeah, so that's the idea.
Okay.
Hi, I've got a question for Michael for the bed detector. Maybe I missed it, but how do you do it with the data collection and the data storage? Because if you have it for a year or a month, it's a lot of data. So how do you do it?
Yeah, the detectors can carry up to 1 terabyte of memory cards. And so I think you might even be able to do 2 terabytes now. So we really don't run into that problem too much. We just buy bigger SD cards.
Quite simple.
No more questions? I want to ask you one, Michael. From the European perspective, in last CW conference, there was a presentation about the Natusius prepistrel migration through the North Sea, and they deployed a lot of bad detectors compared to this. Can you give your opinion, but also what may be the cost of one of these drones? Because for the European side, on the American side, the situation is quite different.
Yeah, the real advantage for us, and the real advantage of autonomous vessel is in areas where there's no platforms. So where there are platforms, it's going to be cheaper and less expensive, and you can put out more on existing structures. We just don't have that option where wind energy is proposed right now in the States, and I imagine that it's like that in many places in the world. So the advantage is that it's a new platform where you couldn't sample for bats before. And then also, because we have control of it, you can do a designed study for the spatial distribution if that's what you want. But you could do that also, obviously, with as many turbines as there are in the North Sea. You can also do that with multiple detectors there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, Michael, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. Don't you, based on understanding of what the business of sail drone is that one of the nice things about this is they could be commissioned to go out and be collecting other information about sort of what's going on in the wind farms. So, you know, this potentially could be some additional, an additional sensor, and it may not, you know, you may not have to do the full brunt of the cost. So it could be some other measurements that are sort of needed.
Yeah, there are many different sensors on it between weather, bathymetry. They've sampled for cetaceans. They've sampled for fish. So it could be that it offers a suite of abilities to meet multiple objectives because, you know, for one objective for a bat, it's probably too expensive, but it can meet many objectives.
Okay, we have 4 minutes if you want to make any more questions.
Maybe a question to Larissa on the birds. Why are they getting electrocuted? Is it that they touch sort of two single pole lines, or that they nibble through the isolation of a sort of a coal line?
That's a good question, thanks. So they are not touching two cables at the same time. So to be electrocuted, you needed to touch two parts with different energy, I will say in few words. So they are like, I think the part that they are interacting more is with the bill and the beak, because they are pecking and probing, and they are like destroying some infrastructure. So if you see the isolator, you will see like the shape of the isolator is very attractive for these species. So the isolator probably is not doing well because sometimes we have like energy still passing through or is not well isolated. So the main fact is that they are interacting like with the beak, the bill beak, and also with more than one individual at the same time. So we have electrocutions with 2 or 3 birds at the same time. So in that case, could be that they are like closing the circuit, like, but thanks.
Okay, yes, thank you. And maybe while I have the mic, a silly question to Michael. Why are the bats worshipping the moon on this island?
We don't know. I'll just leave it seems like bats do, bats use vision for navigation on long-distance migrations. So we imagine it has something to do with that and the visibility. But yeah, there are a lot of questions and unknowns in bat migration.
Okay, and then the last question.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question for Gordon. When using CPOD, do you combine them on some of the stations with acoustic recorders to compare the detection?
Yeah, I should maybe make clear that I wasn't really involved in that original data collection. But as I understand it, there were, some dual moorings where there was, raw acoustic data recorders together with CPODs. But yeah, I'm not sure I could speak too much more than that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everyone and the speakers. And the day is over. Hope to see you soon.